Welcome to Dark Masquerade, where the warmth of the campfire meets the shadows of the unknown. Tonight, I invite you to settle in and join me for an hour-long tale of Krampus, the sinister figure who haunts the holiday season, seeking out the naughty with his twisted sense of justice. Let the crackling fire ease your nerves, if it can, as I take you deep into the darkness of this chilling legend. Before we begin, please hit subscribe, like this video, and share it with those who love a good scare. Your support keeps the fire burning and the stories alive here at Dark Masquerade. Now, let's dive in and remember, not every gift left on Christmas Eve comes from Saint Nick. The Krampus Visit. Christmas Eve had always been my favorite night of the year. The twinkling lights, the cozy glow of the fireplace, and the comforting hum of carols drifting through the house. It was a time that felt magical, even as an adult. But this year, that warmth had turned to ice. I could feel it in the marrow of my bones, a chill that whispered to me that something was wrong. My name is Greg, and I had come to this remote cabin in the mountains to spend Christmas alone. After a messy breakup and a year that felt like an eternity, I needed the solitude. The cabin, surrounded by an endless white expanse of snow and towering trees, was meant to be a refuge. It was the kind of place that during the day could feel like paradise, but at night, it became something else, something sinister. I poured myself another glass of spiked eggnog and sank into the worn leather armchair beside the fireplace. The fire crackled, throwing flickering shadows across the room, but they seemed to dance to a rhythm I couldn't name. Outside, the snowstorm howled like a creature in pain, the wind rattling the windows as though trying to claw its way inside. I glanced nervously at the door, half expecting to see something, anything, standing in the darkness beyond the glass. A distant jingle broke through the wind, so faint I thought it was just the wind playing tricks. But then it came again, clearer, sharper, like the sound of old, rusted bells. It was slow, deliberate, and carried an unnatural weight. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal or some branch caught in the storm, but I couldn't convince my shaking hands to relax. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight, its deep tones echoing through the cabin like a warning. The bells stopped and the wind fell to a suffocating hush. I sat up straighter, listening as the snow crunched under the weight of something large moving outside. The sound was closer now, just on the other side of the wall, and then came the knock. The knock wasn't loud at first, just a quiet, hollow thud against the door, followed by the soft scraping sound of claws dragging across the wood. My breath caught and the hair on the back of my neck rose. I took a shaky step forward, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The air in the room grew colder, so cold that I could see my breath in the dim glow of the fire. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. There was no reply, only silence. Then, a low, guttural growl, deep enough to make my blood run cold. The sound seemed to reverberate through the walls, shaking the cabin like a ragged heartbeat. The knocking came again, louder, more insistent. I backed away, my hand trembling as I reached for the fireplace poker. The growl rose to a roar, mixed with the sound of chains rattling, scraping over the floorboards, dragging closer. I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to block out the noise, but it seeped into my head, the metallic clinking like a death knell. When I dared to open my eyes, the door handle was turning. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. This was something alive, something that knew I was here, and it was coming for me. The handle turned, creaking as it moved, and then the door burst open with a deafening crash. The creature that stepped inside was a nightmare come to life. It was impossibly tall, hunched and shadowed, with long, twisted horns that scraped the ceiling. Its fur was matted and black, streaked with dirt and something worse, something that smelled of rot. Its eyes were the color of embers, glowing with a hunger that made my skin crawl. The grin on its face split wide, showing teeth like broken knives. It stepped forward, chains rattling behind it, the metal dragging across the floor like the scream of 1,000 dying souls. Krampus. I should have run, should have turned and fled to the farthest corner of the cabin, but my body wouldn't obey. I stood rooted to the spot, the poker slipping from my hand as I watched in horror. Krampus raised one clawed hand, the nails long and black, and pointed at me. "You've been wicked," it whispered, its voice a rasp that cut through the silence like a blade. The fire sputtered and hissed, throwing the room into darkness. I stumbled backward, my chest pounding, but Krampus was faster. In a blur of movement, it lunged, grabbing me by the arm with claws that dug into my flesh. The pain was white-hot, and I screamed, but the creature's grin only widened. A sudden burst of heat filled the room, and I felt the hair on my arms stand on end as the fire reignited. Krampus snarled, releasing me as the flames licked at its fur. For a moment, its eyes flickered, the embers dimming as it recoiled. "Stay back!" I screamed, grabbing the poker and swinging it blindly. Krampus snarled, and its clawed hand shot out, swiping the poker from my grasp and sending it skittering across the floor. With a speed that defied reason, it stepped forward, its glowing eyes locked on mine. I stumbled backward, tripping over the rug and falling hard. Krampus leaned over me, the air filled with the smell of blood and sulfur as it opened its mouth wide, exposing teeth that gleamed with a wet, horrible shine. Then the bells rang again, deafening and sharp. I clenched my eyes shut, but the sound cut through me, a shockwave of terror. Krampus let out a roar that made the cabin shake, but it took a step back, its eyes narrowing as though in pain. I took the chance and scrambled to my feet. I grabbed the first thing I could find, a heavy silver candlestick, and swung it with all my strength. It struck Krampus across the face with a wet crack. The creature howled, a sound so deep and terrifying it made my bones ache. The creature staggered back, one hand clutching its face, the other claw reaching out as if to grab me. But it faltered, its eyes flickering with what looked like fear. Before I could react, Krampus let out a guttural growl and leapt for the window, shattering the glass as it disappeared into the night, leaving behind a trail of black fur and the faintest echo of bells. The silence returned, oppressive and thick. I crumpled to the floor, shaking, my body refusing to obey as the adrenaline bled out of me. The room was dark, the fire reduced to dying embers. Outside, the snowstorm raged on, but it was different now. It seemed more alive, as though it too were waiting. The clock on the mantel read 3:14 a.m., but the night felt as if it would last forever. In the dim light, I caught sight of the doll sitting on the mantel. Its cracked face stared back at me, its blue eyes glistening with something that could only be described as understanding. I wasn't alone, and I knew Krampus would return. The night of Krampus. I woke to the sound of footsteps in the snow outside. It was past midnight, the room as cold as the void, the silence stretching until it felt heavy and unnatural. The wind howled outside, slamming against the walls of the cabin with a ferocity that made the floorboards tremble. I shivered under the blanket, the memory of the stories I'd been told as a child surfacing like a specter from the dark corners of my mind. Krampus. The name was as familiar to me as my own, but it was only ever a warning, a tale spun to make children behave. My mother had warned me once, long ago, after I had misbehaved. If you don't stop, Krampus will come for you. I had laughed it off then, scoffing at the idea of a shadow creature who stole children and punished the wicked. It was just a story, I thought, until now. I sat up and listened, my heart pounding as the wind picked up again. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. They scraped against the snow, each step louder than the last, almost as if whoever or whatever was outside was dragging its feet, savoring the hunt. My cabin was deep in the mountains, miles away from the nearest town, secluded by acres of dense pine forest. I had come here to escape, to find peace. But that night, peace felt like an impossible dream. My head spun with panic, but I forced myself to move. Quietly, I slipped from under the blanket and reached for the old hunting knife I kept on the nightstand. The blade was dull, but it was better than nothing. A soft jingle cut through the noise outside, sending a shiver down my spine. It was faint, like bells on an animal, but it sent a tremor through my body, something primal and raw that whispered of danger. The knock came then, a deep thud that vibrated through the cabin. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. Another knock, more forceful this time, and then a scraping sound as something clawed at the door. The jingling grew louder, closer, like the sound of chains dragging over ice. "Who's there?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. My hands gripped the knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. There was no response, only the growl of the wind and the sound of those terrible bells. The door creaked under the pressure of something pushing against it. I backed away, my eyes locked on the handle, half expecting it to turn. The wind blew a sudden gust, and for a moment, the air inside the cabin felt charged. I could see my breath, a cloud of white that trembled in the freezing air. Then there was silence. I took a shaky step forward, my pulse thudding in my ears like a war drum. Just as I reached for the lamp on the table, the door slammed open, sending the wood splintering across the room. I stumbled back, heart slamming against my ribs, as a figure stepped inside. It was towering, far too large to fit through the doorway. Its face was a grotesque mask of twisted features, half beast, half human, with hollow eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. Its mouth was twisted into a cruel grin, revealing teeth that seemed to have been pulled from the mouths of the damned. It was dressed in fur, black and matted, with chains that wrapped around its limbs and clinked with every move. The bells around its neck sounded like death knells, sharp and jarring. Krampus. The creature's head tilted to one side as if examining me, and I realized it was sniffing the air, catching my scent. My limbs turned to stone, the knife slipping from my fingers and clattering to the floor. "You have been wicked," it rasped, its voice like the scraping of bone against stone. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in as I stumbled backward. The creature's eyes, those burning coals, never left me. It stepped forward, and with that movement, the smell of decay and wet fur invaded my senses. I choked, gasping for air as I backed into the corner, the wood splintering beneath my weight. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move, rooted to the spot by sheer terror. Krampus reached for me, fingers long and clawed, grasping with the precision of a predator. I ducked sideways, the air brushing past me as I fell to the floor. My hand scrabbled for the knife, fingers closing around the worn handle just as Krampus's shadow loomed over me. "Please," I whispered, the word barely escaping my lips. Krampus growled, a sound so deep it made the floor beneath me shudder. It moved, and in the blink of an eye, I was pulled to my feet, my body limp with the shock. It brought me close, its foul breath stinking of blood and old, rotting meat. My vision blurred as it leaned in, the jagged teeth glistening with something dark and wet. "Punished," it whispered. A sound, half scream, half sob, escaped me as I raised the knife and drove it into the creature's side. The blade sank deep, biting into its black fur, but it didn't stop. It didn't even flinch. Its eyes widened, glowing brighter as it roared, a sound that split my skull in two. The chains around its body lashed out, wrapping around my legs, dragging me to the floor. I kicked and clawed at the floor, the wooden planks splintering under my frantic movements. Krampus leaned down, one clawed finger reaching for my face. I could see the lines of age and violence carved into its skin, the cold, soulless eyes staring at me as it drew closer, the bells clanging like a death march. With a sudden surge of desperation, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the silver locket my mother had given me. It was the only thing I had left of her, a piece of the past that I never let go of. I pressed it against the creature's chest, and for a moment, Krampus stopped, the fire in its eyes flickering. Then it let out a wail, a noise so piercing I thought my ears would burst. The locket burned hot in my palm, the metal searing my skin, but Krampus fell back, its form contorting as if it were being pulled by some invisible force. The chains tightened around it, pulling it back toward the door, and with a final, ear-splitting roar, it vanished into the night, taking the stench and the fear with it. The cabin was silent again, except for the crackling of the fire. I sat there, trembling, my hands shaking as I stared at the locket, the heat slowly fading from it. I didn't know if I was safe or if this was just the beginning. But one thing was certain, I would never forget the night Krampus came for me, and I knew he would return. Outside, the bells rang again, distant and mocking. The hunt was not over. The visitor on Christmas Eve. I should have stayed in bed, but curiosity got the better of me. The snowstorm had kept me cooped up inside since morning, and as the hours dragged into the night, I found myself restless, peering out of the window, watching the wind whip the snow into a frenzy. The Christmas lights outside had long since gone dark, their glow swallowed by the storm. I was alone, save for the soft, rhythmic hum of the old clock in the hall. It was nearing midnight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I laughed nervously, dismissing it as my imagination. But when the knock came, clear and loud, I nearly jumped out of my skin. "Who could that be?" I whispered. more to myself than anyone else. I lived on the outskirts of town, a small house surrounded by frozen trees and unending white. No one came by this late unless it was an emergency. But with the storm raging outside, I doubted any sane person would be out there. I stood up, the floor creaking beneath my feet, and walked to the door. I hesitated with my hand on the handle, the strange, icy chill in the air making my skin prickle. Another knock, this one softer but persistent, as if the visitor were testing my resolve. "Hello?" My voice trembled as I called out. No answer, only the sound of the wind howling outside. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as I reached for the latch and pulled the door open. There was no one there. My heart sank, the emptiness of the porch sending a wave of relief mixed with confusion through me. But as I started to pull the door shut, I heard a sound behind me. A jingle, like bells on an animal. My breath quickened as I spun around, eyes searching the darkness that crowded the yard. That's when I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the woods, half hidden by the trees. It was impossibly tall, cloaked in darkness. Chains hung from its body, clinking with every slight movement. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but the two crimson eyes that glowed in the dark were unmistakable. A cold, gut-wrenching dread swept through me as I realized what I was looking at. Krampus. The stories flooded back, the tales of a creature who came to punish those who had been bad. I thought they were just old wives' tales, fables meant to scare children into behaving. But standing there, watching me with eyes full of malice, I knew better. The creature stepped forward, the snow crunching beneath its heavy, clawed feet. The bells around its neck jingled, an eerie sound that made my skin crawl. Its breath came out in heavy puffs visible in the frigid night air, and its voice, deep and guttural, echoed through the silence. "You've been wicked," it rasped, the words slithering into my ears like venom. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs were frozen in place. The creature's hand reached up, and though I couldn't see its face, I felt its gaze piercing into me. It extended one long, twisted claw and pointed at me, and then it beckoned. The wind picked up, a sudden blast that nearly slammed the door shut. I stumbled back, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I knew I needed to get out of there, to flee before it reached the house, but my body refused to cooperate. The stories had warned of the creature's speed, how it could appear in the blink of an eye. Before I could move, there was a deep, resonant thud that shook the house. The door trembled in its frame, splinters falling to the floor as the creature pushed against it. I scrambled backward, my eyes darting around the rooms, searching for something, anything that could help me. My hand closed around the old brass candlestick on the mantel. I gripped it like a lifeline, my hands slick with sweat. The door splintered, and then it burst open, the impact sending shards of wood flying across the room. Krampus stood there, massive and looming, its breath like the stench of decay. The chains around its body rattled as it stepped inside, the bells clanging a cacophony of warning and doom. "Please," I gasped, raising the candlestick, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. I'll change. I'll do better." The creature tilted its head, those glowing red eyes narrowing as if it were amused. It took a step toward me, and I swung the candlestick, hitting its arm. The impact sent a reverberation through the room, but Krampus barely flinched. Instead, it grabbed my wrist with a hand as cold as the grave, its claws digging into my skin. "Wicked," it hissed, dragging me closer. I fought with everything I had, clawing at its arm, but its grip was iron. The room spun, the fire sputtering as it was snuffed out, and the only light came from the creature's eyes, an unnatural glow that left me blind with terror. I was pulled forward, past the shattered door and into the night. The snow had stopped falling, and the woods were unnervingly still. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the sound of more bells, distant and echoing. The creature's grip tightened, and I screamed, a sound that seemed to pierce the night. The trees around us seemed to shift, the trunks bending in impossible angles, the ground beneath me quaking. Krampus didn't seem to care. It dragged me further, its chains dragging behind like the sound of 1,000 voices crying out in torment. A shadow moved among the trees, another figure, smaller but equally as terrifying. It was a child with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. It reached out, pointing a finger at me, its voice echoing in the dark. "Wicked," it whispered, and the world shattered into blackness. I woke up on the floor of my cabin, the morning light filtering in through the broken door. The snow was fresh, undisturbed, the storm gone as if it had never been. My body ached, bruised and battered, but I was alive. I stumbled to my feet and looked around, but Krampus was gone. The memory of its eyes burned into my mind, and I knew then that the stories were true. It had come for me once, and it would come again. The bells rang again, faint, almost musical. The hunt had only begun. A Christmas nightmare. I had always loved Christmas. The twinkling lights, the laughter of family, the scent of pine and fresh-baked cookies. It all brought me comfort. But that year was different. It had been a rough one. Mom had passed away earlier in the year, and with her gone, it felt as if Christmas had lost its magic. My father did his best, trying to keep up the traditions and cheer, but nothing felt the same. That night, snow fell silently from the sky, blanketing the world in a thick, cold layer. I sat alone in the living room, staring at the fire crackling in the hearth, the embers casting dancing shadows that flickered and shifted like dark spirits. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel as if you're not alone, even when you are. I glanced at the old grandfather clock in the corner. It was nearly midnight. A strange sense of unease prickled at the back of my neck, as if someone were watching me. I rubbed my arms to chase the chill away, but it only deepened. The wind howled outside, clawing at the house, and I heard the soft jingle of bells carried on the icy gust. "Get a hold of yourself," I muttered. "It's just the wind." The fire crackled, and the room grew darker as the flames dimmed. I stood up, reaching for the log basket and tossing a fresh log into the flames. The warmth returned for a moment, but the shadows seemed deeper, more alive. I sat back down, staring into the fire, when I heard it, a faint, heavy thudding coming from the back of the house. My heart leaped, and I glanced toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. The thud grew louder, closer, like someone walking with deliberate slowness. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as dust. "Dad?" I called, my voice weak. No response. The thudding continued, each step a drumbeat against the silence. I crept to my feet, my legs trembling as I moved toward the hallway. I felt like a fool, listening to every horror story my mother used to tell me growing up, every warning about staying inside after dark. I reached for the hallway light, my fingers brushing against the switch when the sound stopped. I froze, staring into the darkness, waiting for the next noise. But there was nothing. The silence felt too heavy, almost suffocating. I was about to turn around when a deep, guttural laugh shattered the stillness. I stumbled back, my hands clenching into fists as I fought to hold back a scream. A shadow moved, tall and impossibly thin, framed by the faint light from the fire. It was standing in the hallway, and though I couldn't see its face, I could feel its eyes on me, dark and malicious. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The creature stepped forward, its limbs bending in unnatural ways. Its body was draped in a tattered cloak of dark fur, and chains rattled as it moved. Bells, sharp and dissonant, clanged with each step, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. And then I saw its face, twisted and grotesque, with eyes that burned a deep crimson and a mouthful of jagged teeth that seemed to smile with pure malice. Krampus. I had only ever heard the stories of a creature that came for the bad children on Christmas Eve. But seeing it, standing in my hallway, I knew the stories were true. My mother's voice echoed in my mind. "If you're not good, he'll come for you. He'll take you away, and you'll never come back." I backed away, my body colliding with the wall. The creature tilted its head, and the chains around it clinked in a sickening symphony. It took a step closer, and I realized I could see its hands, long and clawed, reaching for me with a hunger that made my blood run cold. "Stay away!" I screamed, grabbing the nearest thing I could find, a heavy brass candlestick. I swung it wildly, but the creature was too fast. It caught my arm with an iron grip that sent pain shooting up to my shoulder. I tried to pull away, but its claws dug deeper, breaking the skin and drawing blood. A flash of movement, the creature's eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I felt the weight of its presence, the pure, suffocating dread that radiated from it. It leaned in close, and its breath was as cold as ice, smelling of death and decay. "You have been wicked," it whispered, the words slithering into my mind like a snake. The room spun, and I felt myself falling, the world around me dissolving into darkness. The last thing I saw before I collapsed was the creature's grin, wide and cruel, and the sound of the bells growing fainter as it receded into the night. I woke up on the floor of the living room, the fire now a dull glow and the room silent except for the heavy thud of my own heartbeat. I sat up slowly, every bone in my body aching, the blood on my arm now dried and cold. The memory of those crimson eyes haunted me, sending a shudder through my entire body. Was it a dream? I whispered to myself, looking around at the familiar surroundings, now tainted by a new and terrible reality. But before I could answer, I heard the bells again, clear and sharp, coming from outside. My heart dropped as I glanced out the window. The snow had begun again, falling like a thick blanket, but in the darkness, I saw movement, a shadow. A figure, its face obscured by the night, stood just at the edge of the woods, and as I watched, it turned its head and I saw those eyes, glimmering red, locked onto mine. The creature was back. I ran to the door, flinging it open and shouting into the night, "Leave me alone!" But the wind swallowed my voice, and the figure only stood there, its body twisting in a way that should have been impossible. The bells grew louder, the chains clinking as Krampus took a step forward, dragging its claws through the snow, the sound a final warning. It was only the beginning. The Christmas gift. My dad used to tell me that there were two kinds of people, those who believed in Santa Claus and those who believed in Krampus. I was never sure which category I fell into until that night. It was Christmas Eve, and the snowstorm had set in hard, as if the sky itself had gone mad. The wind screamed outside, tearing at the window panes and making the walls of our old house groan in protest. I was alone in the living room, trying to keep myself busy with a book, but the words blurred into meaningless shapes. The fire was just a flicker, its warmth barely reaching the corners of the room. The lights on the tree, though, twinkled as if they were laughing at me, their bright colors a stark contrast to the dark, restless night. I glanced at the clock, 11:58 p.m. I had told Dad I'd wait up for him. He'd gone out earlier in the evening to pick up some last-minute supplies, but the storm had worsened, and I hadn't heard from him since. A knot of worry twisted in my stomach. A sudden thud outside, followed by a low growl, snapped me to attention. My eyes darted to the window, but I couldn't see anything beyond the blurred glass, just the whirling white of the storm. I got up and peeked outside, half expecting to see my dad's car or a delivery truck, but there was nothing, just the snow sweeping past in dark, violent waves. Then another thud. This one was louder, reverberating against the house. I froze. The noise wasn't coming from the driveway. It was at the back of the house, near the woods. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal, just static and a warning that I'd have to wait until the storm passed. I cursed under my breath, my heart pounding. I had to check it out. Maybe it was a stray animal, a raccoon, or a coyote. My mind tried to reassure me, but my gut told me otherwise. As I stepped out of the living room and into the hallway, the floor creaked beneath my feet. The house seemed so much colder now, the silence pressing in around me. The hallway light flickered, and I reached out to steady it, but it went out, plunging the house into darkness. "Dad?" I called, but my voice sounded small, thin, swallowed by the void. A faint scraping noise came from outside, and then the sound of chains rattling. It was a sound so foreign, so terrifying, that it sent a shiver down my spine. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I tiptoed toward the back door. The lock was stiff, but I fumbled with it until it gave way. The door creaked open, and I stood there, staring into the snow, the air so cold it felt like ice against my skin. Then I saw it. A figure emerged from the woods, moving slowly, dragging chains behind it that glimmered under the faint moonlight. Its silhouette was impossibly tall, its body hunched and covered in dark fur. A long, battered cloak fluttered behind it, and its face was the last thing I wanted to see. Its eyes were red, burning like coals, and its grin, stretched wide, showed teeth sharp enough to tear through bone. Krampus. The stories I had heard as a child flashed before me. Tales of the Christmas demon who came for the wicked, who stole the bad children away and left only silence in his wake. I tried to shut the door, but my hand froze, paralyzed by the sight of the creature. It raised one clawed, gnarled hand and pointed at me, a gesture that made my entire body turn to ice. "You've been wicked," it rasped, the voice low and guttural, like a growl from the depths of the earth. My legs finally obeyed, and I stumbled backward, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. I fumbled for the phone again, praying for a signal. The creature stepped closer, its chains dragging and clinking, its eyes never leaving mine. It took a deep, shuddering breath, and the air seemed to darken as if the world were holding its own breath. The thud of a car approaching the house broke the silence, followed by headlights slicing through the storm. My dad's old sedan pulled up, tires crunching over the frozen driveway, and the creature paused, its gaze shifting to the car. It seemed to hesitate for just a second, then let out a sound that was half snarl, half laugh, before retreating into the woods. I gasped, my hand flying to my mouth as relief flooded me. Dad was here. He was safe. I rushed to the door, yanking it open just as he stepped inside, his coat dripping with snow, his face flushed and weary. "Hey, kiddo, sorry I'm late. The roads were a nightmare," he said, his voice weary but kind. He didn't see the look of horror on my face, the shock that left me speechless. I pulled him into a hug, holding him tighter than I ever had. "Dad," I whispered, my voice shaking, "there was something out there." His brow furrowed, and he looked out into the storm, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean? I didn't see anything." I opened my mouth to tell him, to describe the creature, but then I noticed something. The bells. The bells that had been tied to its chains. They were in the living room, lying on the floor where I'd been standing. I turned back to Dad, the realization like a punch to the gut. "It's here," I whispered. He followed my gaze and looked at the bells, then back at me, and I knew he understood. His face paled, and he grabbed my arm, leading me away from the door as the bells jingled again, soft and distant, in the hallway behind us. And in that moment, I knew the stories were true. Krampus had come, not to take me away, but to leave a warning. The creature would return, and it would come for me, or for someone like me, every year after that. Because Krampus doesn't just come for the wicked, he comes for the ones who remember. The whispering bells. It started with the bells. The old, rusted bells that hung on the gate outside our house, a remnant from a forgotten Christmas long before my time. They were there to warn of visitors, or so my father said. I never liked them. The way they would jingle on windy nights, cutting through the dark, made my skin prickle. I didn't believe the stories at first. Krampus, they called him, the dark counterpart of Saint Nicholas, a creature said to come for those who were naughty. He was more than just a legend, though. He was the stuff of nightmares. I thought it was all just a tale to scare children into behaving. Until that December. The storm had come in late that evening, blanketing the world outside in a suffocating veil of snow. The wind lashed against the windows, and the branches of the old oak trees bent like they would snap. I was alone in the living room, curled up with my book and a mug of hot cocoa. Dad had gone out to the town hall for the annual Christmas Eve meeting. Mom had died years before, and the festive cheer of the season had long since died with her. The storm picked up, its howl now a roaring cacophony, and then a faint jingle. I paused, my mug halfway to my lips, and looked toward the window. The bells on the gate were moving, though the wind outside should have been loud enough to drown out any sound. The faint jingle grew louder, a rhythmic chime that felt like it was calling me. I shook it off as my imagination playing tricks on me, but the unease festered in my chest. I turned back to the fire, trying to focus on the warmth of the flames. The sound of bells seemed to be moving, creeping from the window toward the back door, as if they were tracing a path to my heart. Then there was a loud knock, a sound that echoed like thunder through the house. My pulse quickened as I stood up. "Dad?" I called, but my voice was thin, almost swallowed by the storm. I crept to the hallway, the floorboards groaning under my weight, and peered out through the small frosted window. All I saw was white, whirling and blinding. The knock came again, harder this time, and I jumped back as the doorknob rattled. It wasn't Dad. The thought made me freeze. Who would be out there in this storm at this hour? The voice in the back of my head, the one that whispered childhood warnings, said the name I'd been avoiding, Krampus. "Please no," I muttered, retreating into the living room. My eyes darted around, looking for anything that could protect me. A bat, a knife, anything. But the room was empty, except for the crackling fire and the flickering shadows on the walls. The bells outside grew louder, their clinking like a parade of chains. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. My breathing came out in shallow gasps, every muscle in my body coiled tight. Then I heard a voice, low and deep, drifting in from the dark beyond the window. "You've been naughty," it whispered, the words like a hiss. I stumbled back, tripping over the rug and slamming against the table. The fire spluttered, casting erratic flashes of light that made the shadows dance and twist as if mocking me. Then I saw it, a shape in the storm, something large and hunched, with red eyes glowing through the blizzard. Krampus. He emerged slowly, his limbs long and sinewy, his twisted face half obscured by a grotesque mask. He stepped forward, chains dragging behind him, clinking and jingling as if in rhythm with his heartbeat. The sound pulled at me, gripped me with an icy hand that froze my blood. I should have run, but I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot. The creature tilted its head, and for a moment, I thought I saw the remnants of a smile on its terrible face. The wind howled louder, whipping through the house and making the fire flicker and die. The creature's voice came again, but this time it was not a whisper. It was a growl, deep and guttural. "Come," it said. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure as it reached out, one clawed hand extending toward the window. Its fingers were long, curved like the talons of some dark bird, and they scraped against the glass, leaving trails of frost and something darker, something that bled. The bells sounded like a warning, a last chance to run. I snapped out of my trance and bolted, my feet pounding the wooden floor as I made for the front door. But I heard the soft thud of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, and the chains clinking like death itself was following me. The front door was locked, but my hands were shaking so violently that I fumbled with the key. The creature was close now, the smell of wet fur and something putrid filling the air. I could almost feel its cold breath on my neck when I finally threw the door open and ran into the snow. I didn't stop until my lungs burned, until the cold clawed at my skin and my vision blurred. I didn't even look back, because I knew what I would see. Those glowing red eyes and that terrible, grotesque grin. It was only when I heard the bells again, fainter now as if moving away, that I dared to stop. My legs gave way and I collapsed into the snow, gasping for breath. I pulled myself up and turned around. The house was dark, silent, except for the wind that still carried those bells, distant but unmistakable. Krampus was gone, but the memory of those eyes, that guttural voice, would stay with me forever. A voice, my father's this time, called out from behind me. "Hey kid, I'm back!" I turned, but when I saw him, I knew it wasn't my dad. He had chains draped over his shoulders, and his eyes glowed red in the dark. "Not now," I whispered, stumbling back as the creature, the real Krampus, stepped out of the woods and into the light, his grin wide and his hands reaching for me. And I knew, with a final, terrible certainty, that I was not going to make it home. The night before Christmas had always been special in our house, even after Mom passed. Dad had a way of keeping traditions alive, making sure the spirit of the season never dulled. But that year, something felt different. The silence was deeper, the darkness thicker. The snowstorm had started hours before, thickening the air until it was nearly impossible to see beyond the window pane. It wasn't until the wind howled in a new, unnatural way that I knew we weren't alone. "Jake," I whispered, looking at my older brother. He was sprawled on the sofa, half asleep, the fire casting warm shadows on his face. The older I got, the more I realized how much like Dad he was. He had his patience, his strong jaw, his stubbornness. But there was one thing I was sure of. He didn't believe in anything he couldn't see, and that included the stories about Krampus. The wind screamed louder, and I swore I could hear something else in its fury, something that made the hair on my arms stand up. A distant jingle like bells, but wrong. They were broken, rattling, each note an eerie laugh that made me shiver. "Jake, did you hear that?" I said, glancing out the window. It was only the black and white blur of the storm, but the sound was there, close now, as if someone was rattling a chain. He sat up, the shift in his posture enough to tell me he was listening. "Probably just the wind," he muttered, but his voice was tight. "Dad should be home by now." "It's late," I said, feeling the cold squeeze of dread settle into my chest. Our father had promised he'd be back before midnight. He said he was just picking up a few last-minute supplies from town, but it had been hours since he left. I glanced at the clock on the wall, 11:47 p.m. I opened my mouth to call out to Dad to tell him to hurry when there was another sound. A thud, this time on the front porch. My blood ran cold. It was too loud to be the wind or an animal. "I'll check it," Jake said, pulling himself up, the muscles in his arms tensing. He grabbed the flashlight from the side table and took a step toward the front door. "Be careful," I said, but he didn't answer. Just gave me a fleeting look of reassurance that didn't reach his eyes. The moment he opened the door, the wind exploded into the room, forcing me to duck as it tore past. The light of the flashlight flickered, its beam bouncing across the dark. The snow fell in blinding sheets, and for a split second I thought I saw movement in the blizzard, a shadow that didn't belong. "Jake?" I called out, but there was no response. The wind carried only the sound of the bells, now so close I could hear them as if they were ringing in my ears. The front door slammed shut behind me, and I staggered back, gasping as I felt the icy chill cut through my clothes. The power flickered and died, leaving us in the dark except for the erratic flash of the fire. A deep, guttural growl came from the hallway, and I realized it wasn't the wind. I wasn't imagining it. It was closer than I wanted it to be. "Jake!" I screamed, my voice high and panicked. The sound of chains rattled as they scraped along the wooden floor, the metallic noise like 100 tiny knives. Then, in the flickering light of the fire, I saw it. Krampus. The creature's body was twisted and sinewy, its limbs too long, joints bent the wrong way. Its face was half obscured by a mask that had the semblance of a goat's, with cracked yellowed horns curving up from its head. But its eyes, they were human eyes, wide and hungry, filled with the knowledge of centuries. It reached for me. Clawed fingers stretched as if they wanted to break through the fabric of reality itself to pull me into the dark. "Run!" Jake shouted. He was behind me now, his flashlight raised, but his face was pale, stricken with the same horror I felt. We backed away from the thing that moved closer, its chains rattling like whispers. I tripped over the rug, and Jake caught me just in time, his eyes wide with terror. But before we could move again, the creature spoke. "You've been naughty," it rasped, voice like the sound of a tomb being sealed shut. The words echoed through the room, cold and cutting. I grabbed Jake's arm, pulling him toward the hallway. We had to get to the basement, to the root cellar where Dad kept the supplies. It was the only place that had a lock sturdy enough to keep out whatever this was. The creature watched us, its movements fluid and wrong, as it reached out with a chain and yanked it across the room. The sharp metallic noise tore into the air, a challenge, a taunt. The stairs were just ahead. Jake was faster, always had been, and he pulled me up, the wood creaking beneath our weight. I glanced back, seeing the creature inching closer, its breath misting in the cold. The basement door was just a few feet away. I fumbled with the lock, my fingers slick with sweat and terror. A heavy hand crashed into my back, and I stumbled, feeling the warmth of the creature's breath on my neck. "Please!" I screamed, wrenching the door open and slamming it shut behind us. The sound of chains striking the wood was muffled, but only slightly. I threw the bolt and backed into the shadows, Jake already crouched behind an old chest that smelled of earth and decay. The creature howled, a sound that cut through me, a sound that promised that this wasn't the end. The bells faded slowly, replaced by the chaos of the storm, but the fear didn't subside. The shadows in the room twisted, but in the dim light, I knew Krampus was still out there, waiting for the time when it could come for us again. The long night of Krampus. It was the kind of snowstorm that swallowed the world whole. The wind howled through the trees, their bare branches clawing at the sky as if trying to escape the suffocating darkness. I'd always liked the snow, even the storms. There was a kind of beauty in how the world seemed to pause, blanketed in white. But that Christmas Eve was different. The snow was deep, heavy, and the night was more silent than usual. I sat in the kitchen, staring at the clock as it ticked toward midnight. The old grandfather clock in the corner had a deep, mournful chime that seemed to echo through the empty house. Dad had gone out hours ago to pick up some last-minute things from town, and he still wasn't back. I kept checking my phone, but there were no texts, no missed calls, nothing. The wind rattled against the window panes, making the glass tremble as if it were afraid. The sound was almost alive, as if something was pressing its face against the glass, trying to get in. I shook my head, forcing away the creeping fear that threatened to take over. "Get a hold of yourself, Jenna," I muttered, but my voice came out thin, weak. My hands trembled as I pushed my dark curls behind my ears and glanced out the window. All I could see was a wall of white, blinding, and merciless. The snowstorm had become an unyielding, living thing. Then I heard it, a jingle. Soft at first, like a distant bell. My blood went cold, and my heart stuttered. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, but it was like it was moving closer, weaving around the walls of the house. Another jingle, this time louder. It wasn't just a wind chime or the sound of a sleigh. It was something else, something that set my nerves on fire. Krampus? I whispered, the name sliding out in a breathless, shaky voice. It was just a story, a warning parents used to scare their kids into behaving, right? I'd heard it 1,000 times, the legend of the half-goat, half-demon who punished the naughty children while Santa brought gifts to the good ones. But that was just folklore, wasn't it? A shadowy tale passed from generation to generation to keep children in line. The jingle grew louder, and I scrambled to my feet. I looked out the front door, but the snowstorm swallowed any sign of movement. Just white and more white, a canvas that seemed endless. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself, but the jingle had turned into a low, rhythmic clinking like chains being dragged through the mud. My hands froze on the doorknob. No one else would be out there in this weather. Not at this hour. The storm had been building all day, turning the world into a frosted prison. And yet something, or someone, was out there. I couldn't explain it, but I felt the presence, a dark and malice-laden energy creeping along my skin. I stepped back, my pulse racing, ears straining as I listened to the sounds from the storm. The clinking had stopped, replaced by a deep growl that seemed to rumble from the heart of the earth. It was not animal, nor human. It was something ancient. The door thudded, and I gasped, stumbling back into the wall. The house creaked as if trying to warn me, as if it knew that something dreadful had come. A shadow passed across the frosted glass of the door, and I held my breath. The silhouette was hulking and twisted, with antler-like horns that scraped against the pane. The eyes, I swear, I could see them, glistening red and hungry. "Jenna," it whispered. The voice sent a shiver down my spine, cold and scraping like nails on a chalkboard. I wanted to scream, but the fear had taken my voice. The thing outside scraped against the glass, leaving deep, claw-like grooves in the frost. I stumbled away, eyes darting around the room for a weapon. The kitchen was dark, except for the soft light from the oven clock. I grabbed a heavy metal frying pan, my fingers shaking so much I almost dropped it. The bells jangled again, louder this time, followed by a sharp, metallic thud as if something large had jumped onto the porch. The house shuddered, and the door rattled like it would break open any second. "Please, God, don't let it in," I whispered, though the room seemed to close in on me, suffocating and too quiet. My eyes were locked on the front door as I heard the scrape of claws against the wood, then a high-pitched screech, as if the creature was laughing at my fear. I knew I couldn't stay. The back door was my only chance. I ran, feet slapping against the wooden floor as I slipped and nearly fell. The jingle of bells followed me, dragging through the hallway like a shroud of death. I reached the back door, twisting the knob frantically as the sound of chains rattling rose behind me. There was a booming knock at the front door, followed by the sound of the lock cracking under a powerful force. I pushed the door open, heart pounding, and found myself outside, the cold searing my skin. The snowstorm roared around me, and in the chaos, I saw it again. Krampus, towering in the storm, eyes like fire and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. "No, please," I choked, stumbling back as the creature advanced. The chains dragged behind it, clinking with each step, the bells on them singing the song of doom. The snow blizzarded around us, blocking out the world, but I knew that I had nowhere to run. Its voice, deep and unnatural, growled, "You have been naughty, Jenna." Tears stung my eyes, and my breath came in gasps, but I didn't turn away. The creature reached out, one clawed hand brushing against my cheek. It was cold, so cold it burned. Then the lights flickered back on inside the house. I blinked, surprised, and saw Jake standing at the doorway, staring at me with wide eyes. "What?" he started. But the creature turned, its eyes now fixed on him. The grin twisted into something more terrible. "You will take her place," it said. And with that, it was gone, leaving behind only the ringing of bells and a silence that seemed to scream. The storm outside eased, as if nothing had happened at all. but I knew better. I knew the night would never be the same again. Christmas Eve had always been a time of wonder for me. I'd spend the evening curled up on the sofa with my parents, the soft hum of holiday music blending with the crackling of the fireplace. I loved the way the house would smell: cinnamon, pine, the sweetness of freshly baked cookies. But that year was different. The night carried a weight I couldn't explain, a tension that clung to my skin and made my pulse quicken. I was home alone. My parents had gone out to visit a friend, a last-minute gathering they couldn't pass up. They promised they'd be back before midnight. I hadn't minded their absence at first. I was older now, 16, and could handle the solitude. The snow had started early that evening, a gentle flurry that soon turned ferocious. The wind thrashed against the windows like an angry beast, and the moon was hidden behind dark, swirling clouds. It was past 11 when I first heard the noise. It started as a distant jingle, light and tinkling like a bell on a pet's collar. I shook it off as the wind playing tricks, but when it grew louder and sharper, my stomach tightened. I got up and looked out the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of a stray animal or a neighbor checking on their car, but there was nothing. Just the black and white blur of the snowstorm, the world lost in its frozen chaos. Then came the low growl, deep and resonant like the sound of a deep rumble from a cave. It sent a shiver down my spine and made me step back from the glass. My breath fogged up the window, and I wiped it away, pressing my face against the cold pane. There, illuminated by the flickering light of the street lamp, was a shadow moving across the snow. It was too large for a person, and its shape was wrong, too twisted, too gnarled. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. What I saw next made my blood freeze. A tall, bipedal figure emerged from the storm, its legs thin and bent in unnatural angles, the way a tree limb twists before it snaps. Its arms hung low, covered in matted fur that bristled with static, but it was its face that made me scream. A dark, leathery mask with glowing eyes, pupils wide and searching. A mouth twisted into a grin full of sharp, jagged teeth. Krampus. The creature of folklore? The dark counterpart to St. Nicholas, who took the wicked children and punished them. The stories told of how he would appear on Christmas Eve, bringing chains and bells and a sack full of misfortune. But those were just stories, or so I thought. The bells rang again, louder, closer now, and I knew that whatever I was seeing was real. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet were frozen to the floor. The creature's head snapped to the side, and it tilted its face up toward the house as if it could smell my fear. I bolted, grabbing my phone and tripping over the rug as I ran down the hall to the basement door. Behind me, the bells were almost deafening, but there was something else. A guttural, wheezing laugh that crawled up my spine like icy fingers. I didn't stop to look back. I shoved the basement door open and locked it behind me, pressing my back against it as my lungs heaved. The basement was cold and dark, only lit by the weak glow of the old furnace. I could hear the sounds from above, the crash of something hitting the walls, the chains rattling like the shrieks of the damned. The laughter was still there, mingling with the sound of footsteps that scraped across the floorboards. "Please, please go away," I whispered, the words barely audible over the pounding of my heart. But it didn't stop. It never does it? I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. I yanked it out, only to see a text from my mom. "We're running late. Don't worry. Stay safe, okay?" I took a shaky breath, trying to calm myself, but then I heard it. The voice, low and rasping, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. "You have been naughty." I turned, my eyes wide as I caught a glimpse of the creature peering through the small, grimy window at the top of the basement door. Its eyes glowed like coals, and its mouth opened wider, stretching impossibly, as if it wanted to devour the entire room. In a flash, I grabbed the old iron poker by the furnace and threw it at the door with all the strength I had. The sound of metal on wood echoed through the basement, but it was drowned out by the creature's roar of anger. A sound so guttural and broken that it felt like it cut through the air itself. The doorknob rattled, the chains scraping against the wood, and I knew I had only seconds before it broke through. I ran to the far side of the room, tripping over a broken stool, and found myself in the dark corner where my father kept old tools and forgotten junk. I pushed through the clutter, looking for anything that could help, anything that could keep that thing out. A sharp, metallic click sounded behind me, and my breath caught as I turned to see the door splintering. Krampus's face was coming through, its eyes locked on mine, its grin deepening as it reached out with a clawed hand. I grabbed the first thing I could find, an old, rusted crowbar. I swung it with all my might as the door splintered, the creature's arm breaking through and clawing at the air. The crowbar met its hand and it screeched, a sound that filled the room with an unearthly vibration. It reared back, its face contorted in pain, but I knew it would be back. The door burst open and the creature lunged for me. I twisted sideways, falling to the floor, and I watched in horror as it reached for me, its mouth opening wider than seemed possible. Then there was silence. I blinked, my vision blurred with tears. The creature was gone, the room was empty, and the wind outside had stilled. I pushed myself up, looking around the dark basement, half expecting it to come back. But it didn't. A loud crash upstairs sent me scrambling for the door, my heart hammering as I ran up to the kitchen. It was my parents, their faces pale and wide-eyed, stepping into the room with snow clinging to their coats. "Jenna?" Mom said, her voice shaking. "What happened?" "We heard." I couldn't find the words. I looked out the window, half expecting to see the creature waiting in the storm, but there was nothing. Just the empty, frozen night. "Are you okay?" Dad said, pulling me into a hug. But I could feel my pulse racing, could still hear the bells and the laughter echoing somewhere deep in the darkness. That night, as the snow kept falling and the world seemed as quiet as a tomb, I realized Krampus was real, and he was out there, waiting, always waiting for the next Christmas Eve. The Visitor on the Rooftop. Christmas was always magical when I was a kid. The twinkling lights, the sound of carolers, and the smell of gingerbread baking in the oven were staples that filled me with warmth. Now, at 23, the holiday had lost its luster. I worked late shifts at the diner, barely able to scrape together enough to pay the rent. But this Christmas Eve, I was determined to make it feel special. The apartment was small, cluttered with boxes and the scent of old dust, but it was mine, and for the first time in a while, I didn't mind the solitude. I'd just finished decorating the tiny tree in the corner when I heard it, a soft thud on the rooftop above. My muscles tensed, and I frowned up at the ceiling, wondering if it was a raccoon or some other critter searching for warmth. The wind had picked up, slamming against the walls and making the window panes rattle. I pushed the thought away, telling myself it was nothing more than the storm brewing outside. But then came the sound, a deep, guttural scraping, like metal dragged across stone. I dropped the glass ornament I was holding, and it shattered at my feet. I stared up at the ceiling as if I could see through it, trying to silence the pounding in my chest. "Get a hold of yourself, Sophie," I whispered, my voice thin in the cold, shadowy room. But it was no use. I was frozen, rooted to the spot, every instinct screaming at me to run but leaving me paralyzed instead. The scratching grew louder, and then a low, hoarse voice rasped as if it were coming from the space between the walls. "Naughty. You have been so naughty, Sophie." My blood turned to ice. It couldn't be. The stories, those old legends my grandma used to tell me when I was a kid, how Krampus would come for those who had misbehaved, dragging them off to the underworld in his chains and sack of horrors. It was a joke, a cautionary tale to keep me from sneaking cookies before dinner. But now, with the sound of breathing, heavy and wet, filling the room, I wasn't so sure. "Please, I'm sorry," I whispered, taking a shaky step backward. The sound above stopped, as if whatever had been there was now listening. I felt my throat tighten with panic. The scraping returned, closer, louder. The ceiling above creaked, and a shadow shifted in the dim moonlight filtering through the window. I backed up until the wall pressed against my spine, unable to tear my eyes away from the form beginning to descend from the dark. It was a nightmare brought to life. A figure twisted and writhing, half man, half beast, with legs like the limbs of a goat and a body covered in matted fur. Its arms were long and sinewy, reaching down to me with claws so sharp they seemed to draw blood from the air itself. Its face was the most terrifying part, eyes red as fire, a mouth twisted into a permanent grin that showed rows of teeth too big and too sharp for any creature of this world. Krampus. The air grew colder, as if the room itself had exhaled. My breath came in panicked gasps, misting in the sudden frost. The creature reached for me, its breath rancid and choking. I scrambled backward, slipping on the broken glass from the ornament, and fell hard. I pushed myself up just in time to see it step onto the floor, its hooves clanging against the wooden boards. "Please, I swear I'll change. I'll be better," I screamed, my voice cracking as tears streamed down my face. But Krampus only tilted its head, the bells around its waist clinking like tiny chimes of doom. Its long, clawed hand moved slowly, reaching for me. "No," I whispered as it loomed closer, the darkness around it almost alive, vibrating with malice. The room was spinning, the world reduced to a tight, suffocating place where only Krampus and I existed. A sudden noise, the slam of my front door. Footsteps. It was only then that I realized I wasn't alone in the apartment. A voice called out, deep and familiar. "Sophie? Are you here?" "Dad?" I choked out, the creature pausing mid-step as its head snapped toward the door. A moment of silence passed before Krampus let out a low, bone-chilling growl, as if it had tasted the air and found something it wanted even more. "No, please, not him," I shouted, but Krampus was already moving, its eyes locked on the new presence. I tried to scramble to my feet, but my legs were weak, trembling as I watched my father step into the room. He didn't see it, not at first. Then Krampus lunged. The room erupted into chaos. The last thing I saw before the darkness claimed me was my father's wide eyes, the terrified scream that cut through the icy air, and the long, clawed hand closing around his throat. I woke up sometime later, sprawled on the floor, the snow still howling outside. The apartment was quiet, save for the faint ringing of bells that seemed to come from nowhere. The light from the street lamp cast long shadows across the room, and I dared to look up. Krampus was gone, but the memory of those eyes, that grin, stayed with me. I didn't need to ask what had happened. I already knew. There would be no Christmas for me anymore, not after that night. Thank you for joining me here at Dark Masquerade by The Fire tonight. I hope you enjoyed this chilling tale of Krampus and felt the icy touch of the holiday's darker side. If you did, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends who enjoy a good scare. Your support helps keep the fire burning and the stories alive. Come back soon for more eerie tales, because here at Dark Masquerade, the shadows are always waiting. Until next time, stay safe, stay warm, and beware of what might be lurking in the dark. Good night.